3 seconds. We will be live. I'll let you know exactly when it's up.
It says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
We're on.
We good to go?
I believe so. Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay. So welcome everybody to This Is Not a Drill. We're grateful that you're joining us tonight. There's a lot going on, a lot moving. We're going to spend the hour in conversation with my movement brother, Sean King. We're going to be talking about all that's happening in the world, well, as much as we can fit into the next hour. Before we get started with the conversation, we want to just, again, thank Pro Bono ASL for partnering with us on every single thing that we do. Thank you, Mac, for translating. I believe Brianna is going to also be participating in the translation. So thank you for providing language justice, Pro Bono ASL. We also want to thank Rajay and Megan from our Black Lives Matter team for providing support here tonight. And we want to remind you that even though we're in the midst of a pandemic and we want to make sure that we stay safe, that we do as much as we can to shield ourselves from COVID, that there's still work to do. There's still targets on the backs of Black people. And the last week has taught us how big those targets are, and we cannot simply be in the crosshairs. We have to fight back. And so there's a lot of work moving. Tomorrow, Friday at 4:30 p.m., there will be a national call on We Keep Us Safe. Those of you who joined us on Sunday for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles general meeting know that we talked about how to develop a community safety plan. We talked about the importance of doing that. And now this will be a national conversation that includes movement elders like Erica Huggins. Baba AK, as many of us lovingly call him, will also be joining us. That's Dr. Akinyele Umoja, the author of We Will Shoot Back and professor of African American Studies at Georgia State. Do you know Baba AK? You were.
Yeah. I knew him since I was a teenager.
Yeah. So Baba AK will be joining us. Of course, our own co-founder, Patrice Cullors, will be there. And we'll be talking about, especially now, why our safety has to absolutely be community driven, why we need a community driven approach to safety. So that is tomorrow, 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. And for more information about how to log on, please go to blacklivesmatter.com. And then we are not letting them steal King Day from us. So on Sunday, we will be out in the streets, joining Clergy for Black Lives, beginning at 11 a.m. on Skid Row. And then from there, we're going to caravan over to Leimert Park, which is also known as Africatown. Will be there by 1 p.m. and we are going to lift up the legacy of the radical king, and so we're going to be doing that on Sunday for King Day. And then finally, the holiday that we have as King Day is Monday. And on Monday, we are launching a new platform called Move the Crowd on KPFK 90.7 FM. So please listen Monday at 7 a.m. So you wake up in the morning and join Black Lives Matter on KPFK 90.7 FM. And we're going to talk about the organizing that we're doing for the week. We're going to give you the week's marching orders, right? So this is what's happening. This is how we get involved. And even in the midst of a pandemic, we're going to continue to organize ourselves and stand up. So with no further ado, I'd love to welcome into the conversation a brother who I don't even remember how we met or when we met. But it's been some years that
I'm trying to think too. I it's been, maybe time flies. I mean, it's been maybe at least 5 years now for sure.
Yeah.
that I feel very blessed to be in community with you, Brother Sean. And, you've been extremely supportive of
what we do in Black Lives Matter, especially what we do in Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. You haven't like requested a lot of acknowledgement, but I do want to acknowledge the critical role that Real Justice PAC played in ousting District Attorney Jackie Lacey, because Black Lives Matter Los Angeles is not a PAC, right? So there's all these rules that we didn't realize when it came time for the election, paying for billboards, paying for some of the things. We couldn't do it because we weren't a PAC. So we asked you, can you pay for this? And you did. And so we're thankful for the dollars. We're also thankful for the strategy support, the organizing support. And, you know, when we were texting earlier in the day and in our pre-conversation, you know, I just said, one of the things that came out, and so I'm just gonna address what may be an elephant in the room. I'm not watching the Facebook comments, but when we posted the flyer on Instagram, we got a whole lot of likes, but we also got a whole lot of comments. And my daughter, who's 14 years old, saw the comments, right? And you know my kids, we've spent time with each other's kids, and I got to meet your spouse, and all of that has been great. And my kids really love and respect you, right? And my 14-year-old daughter said, you know, well, he's kind of famous for his politics. And one of the things that happens is that when you're famous for your politics, people expect you to be perfect. And it's impossible to be perfect because he's just a regular person. And so I want to lift up that you are a regular person. And, you know, it bothered me to see all of that. So I'm going to just straight up tell everybody who's watching, I'm the one who cut off the comments because I didn't want to see those comments, right?
Yeah.
I think we can lovingly engage. We can, you know, absolutely call in folks when we see them maybe doing things that we don't understand, or maybe even making mistakes. But I'm just going to say that I consider you a dear brother, and I feel like I've come to know your heart over the last 5 years, and I'm grateful to struggle alongside you. So I'm gonna just say that, and if you want to say anything else, you're welcome to. If not, we can hop right into this conversation.
Well, I appreciate it. And, you know, first off, I see you as my friend and my sister, and that means that we struggle together, we support each other through highs and lows. A whole lot of what I see in criticism of me, I try to allow it to slide off and like not allow it to hurt my heart, because so much of what people say about me is just not true. Like, there are legitimate criticisms of me that I would always be willing to engage with. If people see a strategy that I had that they don't feel good about, or if people see me sharing a video that makes them uncomfortable, those are legitimate criticisms. But I see every day, including on the post promoting this event or on my page, people say things that just aren't true, be it about me stealing money or mismanaging money. It's never happened, not a day in my life, not from a family, not from an organization. It's a complete fabrication. If people say that I have mistreated people, literally, I have never raised my voice at a person, never said a curse word at a person. Certainly, I've never physically harmed anybody, but I see people regularly talking about me across the internet about things that they know in their heart that I've done that I literally just didn't do. And there's a part of me, I was a pastor for many years, for almost 20 years. There's a part of me that even feels bad for people, because people have convinced themselves that these really ugly things about me are true. And I just have to see it and understand that people are easily misinformed. And I've tried my best, Melina, to be consistent, reliable, And people who know me, who've actually worked with me, like you, I think have found me to be kind, warm, compassionate, available, reliable. But if you look in the comments, some days it's like I'm a monster. And I think some of it just comes with being this well known. You talked about Dr. King just a few minutes ago, and one of the things we know about Dr. King, and his family talks about this every year, is in the month before Dr. King died, he was literally one of the least popular leaders, least liked leaders in all of America, not just with white folk, but with Black folk too. He had a negative approval ratings in white and Black communities. And some of it is just the wear and tear of doing the work, of being in battles all the time. And because I lead with my heart, it still affects me when I see it, but I just try my best to just keep doing the work and still try to live by the principles that guide me from day to day. And so, like, my connection with you and even my connection with BLMLA is just one of those relationships that I just hold near and dear. And it's just one of those relationships I've tried to be real faithful over.
Yeah, Ashe. And I just want to lift up that one of the things that I've learned is that people will often comment negatively, but we have to balance every comment against the likes, right? So if
Yeah.
you got 10,000 likes and 200 negative comments, whatever, right? And
Right.
it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be self-reflective. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, say, well, is this true or isn't this true? But whatever, let it go. Rosa Clemente taught me a long time ago, when people do this, block them and keep it moving, right?
That's what you have to do, but what over the years, I've tried to engage people's sincere criticisms, their questions, their concerns. Like, one of the most sincere criticisms I see every day is the pain that it causes people when I share a video of some type of police violence and they see it and they're harmed and they're hurt by it. I shared a video just 2 days ago of a young father, a pastor actually in Killeen, Texas, who was murdered in his front yard this past weekend. His family asked me to share that. And I have to balance, though, the reality that his family wanted the world to see it. His family wants the world to know the pain that is visiting them right now. But I have to find a way to balance that with the reality that when I share that video, it does cause pain. It is traumatic. It is awful. And every day I wrestle with whether or not to. I get those videos every day. I may share one out of 100 that I get, but when I do, I always do it at the request of a family who's just trying to grasp for straws at figuring out how they get justice. And so, there are legitimate criticisms, and I try to engage that. But at the end of the day, you just have to keep doing the work, keep loving people, and just try to see your way through it.
Yeah. So as we're talking about kind of leading with your heart, trusting spirit to guide us, I really love, because I don't think most people know your story. So I'd love, and not your whole story. We only got an hour, but I'd really love for you to talk about how you got into this work, because you've been using your voice to push back, to counter white supremacy, not since January 6th, not for the last 7 years, but for decades. You've been using your voice and using your talents and using your resources for this purpose. Can you tell me and us why?
I love being able to tell my story. And, I had a book that came out this past August, and in my book, there are several chapters that are about my story, and some of it that I'm going to share now, that were really hard for me to write. I think I don't want to blame being a man on any of this, but there's a part of me that kind of compartmentalized some of the pain of my past, of my childhood. And it was there with me, and I carried it with me like a passenger, but I had kind of boxed it up and didn't tweet about it, didn't share about it. And I try to really unpack how my origin story really shaped the work that I do today. I grew up, so I'm 41. For people, it's hard sometimes to know how old somebody is. And I grew up in a small rural town in Kentucky. And my mother, who's still alive, sweet woman, so I was born in 1979. She had a short relationship with a Black man in the late 70s, at a time when interracial relationships were rare. My mother's a sweet white woman who taught me a lot of the principles that I still lead with today. Like, my mother instilled in me, like, to stand up against people who are bullied. My mother taught me about hard work and decency. She worked at a light bulb factory for almost 45 years. But growing up in this little rural town, Versailles, Kentucky, in the 80s, a product of an interracial relationship, it was weird. We didn't even have the language. Like, we weren't like biracial, multiracial. Those weren't even, I don't even know if those words existed in that way back then. And my mother, and I've talked with other people who kind of grew up the way I did, there was no social media. My mother taught me very little about what it meant to be Black in this world. Like, she exposed me to some people, but it was ultimately local pastors and leaders and friends, and my friends' families and parents, who kind of wrapped me with love and support and showed me from elementary school and middle school and high school what it meant to be a Black man growing up in rural Kentucky. And I didn't have any dreams of, I loved, we're almost on King Day. I loved Dr. King. I loved Malcolm X, and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was a teenage boy, but I didn't plan on being anything like who I am today, as a civil rights leader, a writer. None of those things were really on my mind. And when I got to high school, this is in 1993, I had been in elementary and middle school, I had been popular with people from all racial backgrounds in this little town. But when I got to high school, it was racially segregated in a way that I didn't really understand how to maneuver my way through. And just a few weeks into high school, me and a lot of my friends that I grew up with started being harassed by just open racists. Like, we didn't even have the words for it back then, like white supremacy. But we would literally be called nigger to our face. I had Melina, my freshman year of high school, I lived only maybe a half a mile away from the school. One day I was in school and had a guy throw a jar of tobacco spit right in my face. It was brutal. Day in and day out, we were facing like horrible bigotry and racism. And we would report this to the school. And less than it, like, at that point, it was breaking me down. Like, there was no redemptive story to tell at that point. Like, I was skipping school like every other day. We were regularly humiliated. I was forced into fight after fight after fight. And 2 different times my freshman year of high school, in 1993, 1994, I was chased by this group of racist white students at my high school. One time I was by myself, another time I was with my friends. We were chased They had a pickup truck and literally chased us and were trying to run us down. And I tell that story in my book, just like a horrible, intimidating situation. One day I was walking home, I went to a homecoming dance, and there's a beautiful, funny story about the dance that I love to tell, but I was walking home from that dance and this group of racist students was literally waiting in that pickup truck, and I was going to walk home from the dance. And I saw the students, like I knew some of them by name. And that following, the dance was on a Friday, that following Monday, I reported them to the school. They did nothing. Like they literally tried to run me over. And that continued for almost a year and a half until March of 1995. And in March of 1995, while I was at school, in the middle of the school day, a group of those same students that had harassed me for a year and a half, this was my sophomore year, I was 15 years old, beat me so badly that I missed the rest of my sophomore and all of my junior year of high school recovering from the injuries. I had 3 spinal surgeries, fractures in my face and ribs. And I mean, it was just the lowest of low. Like I was deeply depressed. I don't know what a half a step above suicidal could be, but I mean, I was that low. Like I didn't want to live. The physical pain, the emotional pain. And when I finally recovered, I had the final surgery that I had. When I finally recovered from that, this school was the only high school in this little town. I had to go back to that high school. None of the guys who did this to me were ever held responsible. It happened in the middle of the school day. Faculty saw it, nothing happened. And I had to go back to this school. And as much as that assault took from me, and it took a lot from me, it really took my childhood in a lot of ways. I stopped being a kid having gone through all of that physical pain and abuse. So it kind of robbed me of my childhood and took a lot of whatever, I'll say innocence, whatever innocence I had, that was kind of gone. And when I got back to the high school, I was a different person. And I'd always loved people, but I found myself having a huge heart for people who had been wronged. I had a huge heart for people who had been faced with injustice. Like I was still going through this myself. And as much as it took out of me, that really low moment put in me just like a real passion for standing up for people. And so even over this past week, as I try to identify the men who took over the Capitol, which is crazy to even hear those words come out of my mouth, like people literally took over the United States Capitol. In some ways, and I don't even know if it's healthy, in some ways, it's still me processing through all that I experienced as a boy of this moment. I'm 41, so that was 26 years ago that I was assaulted. And it just shaped me, and it's caused me to, so when you see me tracking down people, white supremacists or bigots who either did harm in Charlottesville or at the Capitol or elsewhere, in a lot of ways, it goes back to that pain that I experienced so long ago. And so when I emerged from all of that, I found myself just with a real passion for justice. I moved to Atlanta to go to Morehouse, and that really started my journey as a student leader, as an activist. That was in 1997. And when I was at Morehouse, there were 2 or 3 events that kind of shaped me forever. There was a young brother named James Byrd, who was literally lynched by white supremacists in Jasper, Texas. And this kind of brutal, he was literally lynched. And this was before Twitter, before Facebook. And as a student in the 90s, we learned like, oh, this is still a very real reality for us. Then in 1999, I was student government president at Morehouse. I was organizing and doing protests and demonstrations all over the city and even around the country. But in 1999, a young brother who was just 2 years older than me named Amadou Diallo was shot and killed by police in New York. And it was the first fatal police shooting that I felt deeply personally connected to. I was a leader on campus, and I had traveled the country speaking about police violence. But Amadou for us was kind of what Breonna is to your kids and my kids, what Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd, what how they see people who've been killed this year is how we saw Amadou in 1999 and 2000. And so all of those things really shaped how I saw this thing we call the justice system. It shaped how I saw how we fight for justice and change. And when I graduated Morehouse, I taught high school history and civics. And then for several years, this is 2003 through 2006, I worked full time as a teacher in Atlanta's jails and prisons as a career. I was a traveling teacher at 14 different jails and prisons around Metro Atlanta. And this was before books like The New Jim Crow had come out. And even then, we didn't have all the language for mass incarceration. But those early moments and encounters really shaped the work that I do today. And so here we are, 2021, fighting for change in cities all over the country. But that early work that I did as a teacher in jails and prisons, fighting for Amadou's family, learning about what happened to James Byrd, processing even what I dealt with myself, all of this stuff shaped me in immeasurable ways. And social media is weird because you only know people for what they posted yesterday or last month. And it doesn't really give you a chance to kind of share the long view of your story of who you are. And so I see people all the time say like, who is this guy and where did he come from? and social media doesn't really give you a tweet doesn't really give you the chance to express that in a smart way, you know?
Yeah. But
Yeah.
some of it's in your book, Make Change.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
we'd love for folks to pick that up. I do want to get to this, what's happening in this country and your approach to justice. So one of the things that I see you doing that's unique, and I think we all kind of have to figure out our place and how we make change, right? So for me, I feel like my gift is I'm an educator, right?
Yep.
So I engage in that work. You know, I think I'm pretty good at it. I come from a line of, you know, at least 3 generations of women who are educators. My mom is who you met, right?
Yep.
My mom is an elementary school teacher. My grandmother before her was a teacher in Beaumont, Texas. And you know, it's kind of our family track. My brother is an educator. My sister
It's in the bones.
Yeah, it's in the bones,
Yeah.
right? And so how do you bring, you know, what you are kind of divinely blessed with to the movement? And I feel like part of what you've done is kind of bring this sense of needing to shed light on what's happening. And one of the things that you've become known for is exposing white supremacy. So not just white supremacy in theory, but white supremacy in practice, as in who are these people? How did you kind of get to that? And how does that kind of play a role in the larger struggle to counter white supremacy, the white supremacy that is really the foundation of this country, right? This country is built on the stolen land of indigenous people and the stolen labor of African people. So how does exposure of individual white supremacists help us to undo and end white supremacy, at large?
That's a great question, and it's part of even why I wanted to share even some of my own personal story of saying some of what I'm working through even has its roots and origins even in where I came from. But there are a couple things at play. In this country, we love to talk about even racist systems, but we have to understand that people run these systems. Like, they have human representations, they have policy implications. And part of what I try to do is to show people that we're not just fighting back against like a nebulous form of racism, but we're fighting back against people who prop up and hold these systems and maintain them and advance them. Some of what you see me doing, even over these past few weeks, of saying, who is this person that did this thing? It really started in Charlottesville. Deandre Harris, who was a teenage boy who was, at the time, my oldest daughter is now in college. She's 21, and she and Deandre are the exact same age. And Deandre Harris was a teenage boy from Charlottesville. And when white supremacists came to Charlottesville, like many residents in Charlottesville, he was there to basically be a counter demonstrator in his own town. And a group of white supremacists mauled this young man and literally almost beat him to death. They caused a traumatic head injury. And when I saw what happened to Deandre in real time, I had the thought, if the men who did this to Deandre get away with it, we may see what they did to Deandre duplicated all over the country as these white men. Now, mind you, Melina, they beat Deandre in the police station parking lot. Like, literally, the police station is here, Deandre is in the parking lot, and they beat him in the parking lot with weapons and left him there. And then, just like we saw at the Capitol, they just walked away. And police were literally 10 feet away from the entire encounter. And my thought in that moment was, if they're allowed to get away with what they did to Deandre, we may see such a dramatic spike in white supremacist violence that it may be duplicated all over the place. And so, and I talk about this in my book, my personality is sometimes like obsessive. I threw my whole life into finding these men who did that to Deandre. And of the 5 men who participated, we tracked down 3 of them, identified them, and basically forced the system to hold these men responsible. Charlottesville had no intention on doing it. The state of Virginia had no intention on doing it. The FBI had no intention on doing it. We had to basically squeeze any semblance of accountability out of that system ourselves. And I knew what I'm about to say, I knew in theory, but I then understood, working with Deandre and his family and his attorneys to identify these men, is that this thing that we call the justice system, it was not built to give us justice. It was built to punish us. It was built to oppress us. It was built as a tool of power. And all of a sudden, when Deandre and his family, who I hate to play respectability politics, but we're like hardworking, respectable, middle-class folk in Charlottesville, like active citizens, when all of a sudden they wanted the system to work for them, it didn't, not at all. Like we had to squeeze that system for it to give any type of accountability to Deandre and his family. And even to this day, now almost 4 years later, two of the men who did this in broad daylight, we still have not identified these men. Like they didn't even have on masks. They were as clearly as you and I can see each other now. I have 100 pictures of these men, and they were still never identified. And it taught me a couple of things: that the system was not built to give us justice. We have to squeeze whatever justice we get, we have to squeeze that out of it. But it also taught me that violent white supremacists, and there's a thin line between violent white supremacists and violent police officers. And in some ways, police officers often are violent white supremacists.
Right, right.
What I saw was the same parallel, that the struggle to hold violent police officers accountable was the same struggle that we were having to hold the violent white supremacists who beat Deandre accountable. And what I learned is a lot of what we're seeing at the Capitol this week is that people think, and I understand how they think this, those men didn't think they would ever be held accountable. And so when they marched into the Capitol and took over the building and broke into the building, and when they walked right back out of it, they never imagined that there would be any accountability. And some of what I'm grasping for, and I have to admit to you and people who are watching, is we're often experimenting in how we pursue justice and accountability. All I'm trying to demonstrate to anybody who comes after these men is, if you do this to Deandre, or if you do this, if it's a police officer or if it's an everyday citizen who brings violence to our community, we will go out of our way to hold you accountable with whatever tools we have. So sometimes, Melina, I'm not able to hold people accountable through convictions with the justice system. Sometimes all I'm able to do is shame them. And in some ways, that's what happened in Los Angeles with District Attorney Jackie Lacey. It's like, okay, if you're going to let hundreds and hundreds of officers go free without ever holding them accountable for their most egregious acts, we will make you famous for it and shame you for it every single day. And so, you know, what we're trying to do is to create a society that has a baseline of safety for us. And there are 100 different ways of trying to get that safety. And one of the ways I'm doing it is just trying to let people know, if you act out against us, we will find you and hold you accountable in any way we can. And we don't just do that. You know, you began this conversation, you know, talking about the smart ways we partnered to make sure that Jackie Lacey was never the district attorney again. And our organization, Real Justice, has now helped to elect 22 new district attorneys all over the country, including in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, St. Louis, San Antonio, Jackson, Mississippi, Orlando, Florida, all over the country. And so we're trying to do anything we can.
Are you at all in communication with Jody Armour? I don't know if you've ever met Jody Armour.
We've DM'd each other some over the years, and have tried to encourage each other. And I came out to, this is way before the pandemic. We did this is so random. Charles Barkley tried to have a TV show. it didn't go well. But he had me and Jody, he had me and Jody on, and it was like, I think TNT hired Charles to do like a special on race, which is a horrible idea. But they brought me and Jody together, and we made the best of it. And so Jody and I met that one time out in Los Angeles for that. But I love him.
His book, I call it In Theory because I cuss a lot, but I never use the N word. One of my mentors, Mr. Navies, broke me of that when I was 14 years old. So his book, In Theory, really is an examination of the potential for progressive DAs. So I just think it's one of the most brilliant recent books I've read.
Yeah, I love it too. And what we're trying to, you and I texted a couple of days ago when we were thinking about this conversation, and there's the reality that we live in, this country that we live in, and there are all of these systems that function, some behind the scenes, some of the systems we have to deal with day to day, and they're in our face. What we're realizing is, even for those of us who are abolitionists and believe that the whole system needs to be torn down, my theory of change is, I agree with that, but my theory of change is that it has to be torn down piece by piece, policy by policy. Of course, if we could wipe it all away in one fell swoop, that would be my preference. But it appears the reality is that we'll have to tear it down policy by policy, law by law. And one of the ways that we've tried to do that is through the election of courageous district attorneys. And one of my favorite examples is probably in San Francisco. The DA there is Chesa Boudin. And Chesa said something. I campaigned with Chesa when he was running, and he said something, and I don't mind admitting this. When he said it, I thought it was really far-fetched. He was campaigning, and he said that he wanted to cut incarceration in San Francisco down by 50% in 4 years. And nobody's done that. And I thought, I didn't know if he could do it in 4 years. I thought it would, if he could ever do it, I thought it would at least take 8 years. Well, he ended up cutting incarceration in San Francisco down by 50% in 6 months. The thing that I didn't think it could happen in 4 years. He did it in 6 months.
And crime did not increase.
No, it didn't increase at all. It's, in fact, the city is safer in measurable, tangible ways. And that's now the process that Los Angeles is about to deeply undergo, to say, how do we decriminalize poverty, mental health, substance abuse? How do we decriminalize Blackness itself in the city of Los Angeles or the city of San Francisco? And it doesn't look the way abolitionists, I think, dream and imagine it to look. But to me, it's the closest example of, in 6 months, 50% fewer people, 60% less now are incarcerated in San Francisco. And I think that's exactly what we're about to see in Los Angeles as well. And so policy by policy, we're trying to tear this horrible system down that was meant to oppress us. And what we have to be really careful with is that we don't replace it just with a new oppressive system that just looks shinier and cleaner, but is still equally oppressive. And it's harder to do than it may appear.
Yeah. So I promised our crew that they would get questions in. So we got a whole bunch of questions, but I want to ask you one more before we get to theirs, which is, we hear a lot of, especially leftist activists, saying things like, what happened on January 6th wasn't surprising. Okay, the white supremacy is not surprising.
Right.
But when we look at what happened, that shit was surprising. like watching white people scale the walls of the Capitol and like come out with like animal skins and, you know,
Right.
that was, I couldn't have I know we were expecting January 6th. I didn't expect that kind of shit. I mean, I'm still astounded.
Well, here's the thing. Like, I see people all the time say that, just what you said, why are you surprised? Again, I'm not surprised by white supremacy. I'm not surprised by the absurdity of white supremacists. But the United States Capitol has not been overtaken since the War of 1812. And so we witnessed something that hasn't happened in 200 years. So yes, it is surprising. It's surprising.
What would you call it? What was that? Like, they keep using this term insurrection. As a professor of Pan-African studies, I don't like it. An insurrection is an uprising of oppressed people against authority. That is like, you know, what our ancestors did, insurrections of enslaved people, right? So I think insurrection is an inaccurate term, but that's my view. What do you call what we saw?
And that term insurrection, we feel a kinship to it when we think of Denmark Vesey or Gabriel Prosser or Nat Turner or other. We see them and think of what they did, and it's like, no, this is not that, because this wasn't rooted in oppression. This was rooted in privilege.
Right.
And so what do you call it when privileged, even delusional people do what they did? I've been trying to call it a siege, it was a siege or I've even, just to speak in practical terms, I've just been saying the violent takeover of the American Capitol. But I think what we're struggling with is, you know, how do you describe what they did, in part because we're still learning day by day what their intentions were. You know, some people have tried to call it a coup attempt. All of us are struggling for the language. What I do know is, had some of the men and women that are in Congress that I've grown to really respect, had any one of them gotten a hold of those men or women, we could have had dead elected officials or hostages. Like, it was a very fragile situation, and it's complex because there was the Capitol police officer, and whose story I shared on social media, who led that white supremacist mob away from the Senate floor. And even how I tell his story, as for those of us who fight against police violence and just the police state in general, I've even tried to say, like, there was heroism there, and tried to find ways to talk about it.
Yeah, my children are walking in and out, which is great, bringing me water, but
No, I'm dealing. A few minutes ago, my wife was texting me, and we have a dog now, and they were saying, "Listen, Sean, the dog needs to go to bed. So, like, when are you gonna finish?" So they were texting me. They were like, "Hurry up! You're not that important. Stop sounding important and put the dog to bed."
Yeah. Well, let's get in some of these questions before you got to put the dog to bed. Tell them 11 minutes. I promise.
Yeah,
11
yeah.
minutes. So one of the things that's being brought up is the complicity and participation of police in this violent siege, right?
Yeah.
So I know you exposed and tracked down NYPD officers who were there. We're just finding out that at least one LAPD officer participated. And that's what we've been able to find out so far. But can you talk about that? Because it wasn't just police kind of not doing their jobs. It was police. You captured police opening barriers and helping
Yep.
people down the steps and
flashing their badges. So the first we learned, well, even to go back a little bit more, I learned today that since 2001, nearly 300 Black police officers for the Capitol Police, the U.S. Capitol Police Department, have filed lawsuits against that department, against the Capitol Police. And so racism and discrimination has been ever present in the Capitol Police for generations, and nearly 300, and it's not that big of a department, 2,000 officers, 300 of them have filed suits just since 2000. That's a huge percentage of them. So I'd never heard that until this morning. So we're now knowing that racism and bigotry is within that department. And even the officer who was killed, and I'm not here to besmirch his name, that officer was, he had an account on Parler, the kind of white supremacist social media website. He was a huge, huge supporter of Donald Trump. And in some way, I think because so many officers inside of the Capitol Police Department saw Trump and those people as their allies, it made them almost incapable of even seeing the threat, even to the point where that officer who was killed was a devout Trump supporter. And so not only do we see problems within the department, like we saw a Capitol Police officer taking selfies with the men. Another Capitol Police officer put on a MAGA hat and was leading people around. And by that night, Melina, by that night, 2 Black police officers for the Capitol Police Department, they were the first ones who posted on Facebook that they said white men were flashing their badges all day long from police departments all over the country. And those two Black police officers who posted that on Facebook said that those white men had called them the N-word all day long and had flashed their badges all day long. And we've now identified at least 40 different police officers from all over the country, including police chiefs, detectives, lieutenants, supervisors, who weren't just at the protest, but literally helped facilitate this siege at the Capitol. And what's really peculiar, I track a lot of police websites that do memorials when police officers are killed. Those police websites don't even mention the officer who was killed at the Capitol, as if they don't recognize this guy as one of their own. So there are a lot of systems at play here. And those officers not only abuse their authority, they help facilitate it. I mean, I've seen at least 100 photos of people with earpieces. I don't mean AirPods. I'm talking about security earpieces. We see people that look like officers speaking into wrist pieces. And so there was a security apparatus at play. And I think until a real thorough investigation happens, we're just now scratching the surface of what was really going on there.
Right. And as you are bringing up these complaints against Capitol Police, these reports of racism among Capitol Police, we absolutely have to say the name Miriam Carey, who
Yep.
was murdered in 2013 by Capitol Police for making a U-turn, a Black mother, young Black mother, for making a U-turn. And, when we contrast that with the white supremacists who were able to scale walls, break into offices, threaten the murders of elected officials, it is just an unveiling of the depth of white supremacy. But also, and this came from one of our members, it also affirms that lineage of policing that comes from slave catching.
Oh, for sure, for
So
sure.
can you talk a little bit about that? We know that there's been a tracking of white supremacy into police. In Los Angeles last year, we found out that LAPD was advertising, trying to recruit officers, people to apply to be LAPD officers in outlets like Breitbart, right?
Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about that and how we might still see that legacy present in contemporary policing?
Yeah, I think when people hear that modern policing has its history and lineage in slavery and slave catching, I think they thought that was just like a meme or just like something we were saying that wasn't actually rooted in history. It's like, no, modern policing and modern systems of mass incarceration literally were built primarily as tools of power and oppression during slavery. And there were hardly even police departments and hardly jails during slavery. And as soon as slavery ended, we then see an explosion of police departments and jails and prisons to now no longer police enslaved Black people, but to police and incarcerate free Black people. And, we talked about Jody's book, but there are probably 3 books that I would recommend that help me see what we're dealing with now. One is Slavery by Another Name. And it won the Pulitzer Prize when it was first written. And what it does is it tracks the early creation of the mass incarceration complex as it just being a direct descendant of slavery. And it's a powerful, powerful book. Then, of course, The New Jim Crow. And I mentioned The New Jim Crow because a lot of people have purchased it, but not nearly as many people have read it. So it's not enough to purchase it. You have to read it. And then there's a book that I recommend that changed how I saw policing and mass incarceration. It's called Locking Up Our Own. And it's by James Foreman Jr. And it also won. His father, James Foreman, was a civil rights legend. James Foreman Jr. was a public defender in DC. Now he's a law professor at Yale. And even though the book won the Pulitzer, there's a reason the book never went viral. The book is really about the role of the Democratic Party in building mass incarceration and policing. And so in those 3 books, you see how the systems were built. And what you come to understand is that police departments are primarily funded to heavily police Black communities and Black people. That's their primary objective. And so over and over again, what we see is these horrible threats of white supremacist violence go virtually undetected because these police departments were not created to detect them. And just to go back even 3 weeks, there was a bombing in Nashville, Tennessee, that destroyed multiple city blocks. Well, people had literally called this man in for a year and literally said, this man is making bombs in his backyard. Well, again, the Nashville Police Department was not created to really monitor a white man making bombs in his backyard. And so they did nothing about it until he literally detonated those bombs and blew up multiple city blocks. And I could go down the long list of white supremacist actions that police should have stopped and intervened, including the attack on the Capitol. But the entire police apparatus was not built with that purpose in mind. It was built with policing and punishing and oppressing Black communities in mind. And so what we see is that entire system, including the Capitol Police Department, when they imagined an attack, they imagined it being a very different type of person leading the attack. And so race is deeply embedded in even why the Capitol attack was allowed to happen in the first place. It's not just party and politics. Race and racism is at the root of it.
Absolutely. So I know we promised to get you off by now so that you can put your dog to bed. And are there any last things that you think we should be aware of? Any last words as we move forward? We're really grateful that you joined us for the entire hour and for your ongoing work. What would you leave us with? What can folks do to really end white supremacy?
Well, first, thank you for sharing this time with me. Thank you to the Pro Bono ASL team and to BLM LA for your love and support. And I enjoyed being here with you. I think there's an opportunity ahead for us here in January, February, and March. Our country is at a really difficult time, from the coronavirus pandemic, from the attack on the Capitol. And those things are taking up so much of our energy that it could be hard to imagine that there's other things we could be fighting for and getting done. But I think 2021 is going to be an opportunity for us to actually accomplish a lot on racial justice, on how we even address fairness economically with business and entrepreneurship. And if we play our cards right, we could fight back against this pandemic, fight for the safety and health of our communities, and advance smart policies. I think the past few months, it's hard to think about it because so much else is going on. We've actually accomplished a whole lot of good. And I think we can continue to do that, but we'll have to do it while we fight back against so many other things that are going on. And so we're going to have to try hard to stay focused. Some of us are going to have to break away and fight for very specific policy changes, and that can be difficult. But even as I look into 2021, I'm still encouraged. I'm still encouraged that there's a lot of good that we can get done in the midst of all the madness, all the pain, all the drama that's going on. There's still a lot of good that we could accomplish. And so hope we can continue to work together, but enjoyed spending some of the evening with you. And sorry we didn't get to many of the questions that we had.
It's all right. So we are wrapping up, but before we go, when you said that there is different things that we can do, we want to lift up that we're really committed to making sure we support Black-owned businesses that support community. And so you'll find on our Instagram page at BLM Los Angeles a new post for Juice Bay, which is in Culver City. It's smoothies, juices, and herbal supplements. We want to make sure that we support Black-owned businesses. They've projected that 40 to 50% of Black-owned businesses will permanently disappear amidst this pandemic. We think it's much higher than that because we're already looking at a 40% shutdown rate. So please make sure you support Black-owned businesses. You can also go to verifiedblackowned.org, which is our year-round support for Black-owned businesses. We're also calling for justice still in the name of Oscar Grant. Please go to justiceforoscargrant.com to sign the petition so that the second officer who murdered Oscar Grant in 2009, his name is Anthony Peroni. We want to make sure that he is charged for Oscar Grant's murder. Please continue to demand justice for Christopher Deandre Mitchell. Please engage. All of this is on blmla.org, and join us tomorrow as we talk about how we keep us safe, community safety planning. For more on that, go to blacklivesmatter.com. Thank you so much, Sean King, for joining us for the entire hour, but more than that, for your ongoing work, for your commitment of your self, your life to this beautiful struggle. We're grateful for you, and we pray for your continued protection and guidance. Thank you, Pro Bono ASL, for partnering us with in all things, and for Megan and Rajay and the whole BLMLA team. Until next week, we will see you, inshallah. Peace.